Hello, Mr. Duda. It's me, Austin. I am doing my project or my presentation over voluntary euthanasia. Something I do want to kind of say real quick. This is kind of an awkward angle. I'm in my kitchen right now. I do have a puppy I just got who is probably going to be heard in the background. But I can't do this on my couch or anything, or else he would try to play with me, eat my laptop, all that fun stuff. So if you hear him walking around, just please, try to ignore him. I hope he's not going to be crying or anything like that. So, getting back to my paper, so voluntary euthanasia, the title of the paper is Voluntary Euthanasia Morally Justified. So for the abstract, I have voluntary euthanasia as a difficult topic to talk about for a plethora of reasons. Why we have to think about the possibility of making it legal is for a few good reasons, but we also have to think about the possible consequences behind the legality of legal euthanasia. For example, one of the sketchy things we have to consider, if someone is intellectually disabled or not able to make their own clear choices, should they be able to determine if they should essentially commit legal suicide? So, voluntary euthanasia is a questionable legal modern moral stance because we have to take both seriously and think of the possible consequences and what can come out of it. There are some serious reasons that would lead someone to want to commit suicide legally. Of course, that does not mean suicide is necessarily illegal, but in terms of wanting to take your own life, doing it with someone who can make sure it's painless, one is truly sought after. So why? Why would someone want to take their own life? Well, it can be sad, but an interesting predicament for some. When we consider something like a terminal illness, it can be tragic for that person to be told now they have to consider how they will live their life from this point on. However, it can be incredibly difficult for the person to handle. Not only must you think about the physical problems that come with a terminal illness are immense. With something like cancer, for example, when it turns to terminal, the physical and financial problems that come with it are things not everyone wants to deal with. Being physically sick for an extended period of time can take a toll on the one affected, as well as the family watching the illness take a hold of someone they love. The financial side of things can also be a horrible price to pay for being sick, unfortunately. The person who has the terminal illness may seek the option of voluntary euthanasia, or otherwise known as suicide. Do we let them seek the legal option of going to a licensed professional and having a painless death rather than eventually succumbing to a terminal illness anyways? So for the support of voluntary euthanasia, the following quote is quite long, but it breaks down the reasons why in Canada, where voluntary euthanasia is a legal option, why people choose to go that route. So the quote goes as follows. The patients who had assisted deaths ranged in the age from 42 to 102 years old, with the mean age of 74.1 years. 45% or 51 of them were male, and 107 or 95% were white. The most common diagnoses were malignancies that were patients with end organ failure, most likely heart failure and lung disease. And neurological diseases were the most common diagnoses with 25 cases. 9 of those were motor neuron diseases with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Other reported diseases included 4 people with extreme frailty, who had an average age of 92 years. In this quote, what I want to focus on is the fact that 24% of those who want to pursue legal life-ending methods already had long-lasting life-ending illnesses like heart failure. This supports the claim that I previously wrote about in a similar circumstance, the fact that something like terminal cancer may also lead someone to want to pursue the option of legal euthanasia. However, something that will be discussed in the following few paragraphs are the principles that can be applied to this argument, as well as a counter-argument about the reasons on why we should make something like that illegal and keep it illegal. Another quote which goes as follows to again support voluntary euthanasia is Anita Hanig, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Brandeis University, also distinguishes MAID from suicide. Terminally ill patients who seek an assisted death aren't suicidal absent a terminal prognosis. They have no independent desire to end their life. Patients who pursue medical aid in dying are no longer looking at an open-ended lifespan either. To qualify for an assisted death in states with these laws, they must already be on the verge of dying. That is, within 6 months of the end of their life. These patients don't face a meaningful decision between living and dying, but between one kind of death or another. Something that was mentioned in that previous paragraph is MAID. MAID stands for medical aid in dying. with this being an acronym used instead of voluntary euthanasia. A big point of support for MAID is, again, terminally ill adult patients that are not necessarily suicidal, but at the same time would prefer to take the route of having a professional help assist them end their lives instead of eventually coming to the terminal illness that they have. Basically going back to the quote and saying the same thing she said, where they're choosing between one death or another. So I have a couple different counter arguments to voluntary euthanasia. One major reason why we still might oppose the legality of voluntary euthanasia is because it opens a Pandora's box if you will have questionable legal problems and ethical problems that come from it. For example, we can take a look at the situation of guardianship over someone who may struggle or may not be able to make their own decisions. If this is the case, would it be legal for the guardian to decide on behalf of the individual they make decisions for to decide that that person should essentially legally be killed? This is what makes voluntary euthanasia a possible outcome in the future, but at the same time, the legal circumstances behind it must be considered prior, and this stuff has to be looked into. Another questionable reason why voluntary euthanasia has to be looked into further before legalization of it is if someone is intellectually disabled or not able to make a clear decision, or even if someone may be having a brief mental crisis and deciding that they want to wish to die. With something like depression, for example, when someone has depression, it can take various forms, which is true. Sometimes it can be a short term, sometimes it can be long term. But the point being is that it eventually passes. That person is just in a bad mental state for a brief period of time or over an extended period of time, but may not hold the same thought process constantly. So what if they also decide on impulse that they wish to die one day, but decide against or end up regretting it during the process? The following quote in support of the counter-argument mentions why it should be something that stays illegal by saying so-called safeguards are simply statements of what would happen in an ideal world. They do not reflect the real world stresses of clinical practice, terminal illness, and family dynamics. It is impossible to ensure that decisions are truly voluntary and that any coercion or family pressure is detected. Another quote that I'll use in this counter-argument is the fact that the medical professionals that would be in charge of doing the act of euthanasia do not even know the patients that are requesting the euthanasia. So how could they confirm that this is something that they really wanted? The quote goes as follows: in modern clinical practice, many doctors know little of patients' lives beyond what the busy doctor may gather in a consulting room or in the hospital ward. Yet the factors behind a request for assisted dying are predominantly personal or social rather than clinical. Assisted dying is not a role for hard-pressed doctors. Basically getting into the point that doctors are busy all the time. They don't really know the person personally outside of the office. So, it's kind of a sketchy territory for them to really say that they can 100% go through something that they don't really have the background information on. So some of the theories I applied 3. So one of the theories we discussed early on in class in Chapter 2 is the divine command theory, which in essence is about the fact that it goes against God and or the Bible, and that it is something that should be frowned upon ethically or morally. Using this, we can apply the divine command theory to the voluntary euthanasia argument. According to the Bible, suicide is looked at as self-murder and a sin. Voluntary euthanasia is considered suicide by a doctor, which still qualifies as suicide, so using the divine command theory, we can speculate that those who follow this theory look at the voluntary euthanasia as unethical or immoral. I'll include a brief quote from a Christian website that explains suicide in terms of following the Bible. In each of these instances, except for that of Samson, suicide in the Bible is presented in an unfavorable light. So I didn't include the instances. There was, I think, about 6 or 7 of them. Essentially, with the exception of Samson, the rest of them were being looked at as, like I kind of talked about briefly, just self-murder. So to sum up the passage and quote, there were multiple instances directly from the Bible that were discussed, and there are things that are being looked down upon. From that same chapter, we can look at the opposite of divine command theory and look at something like natural law. According to the principles of natural law, an action is morally right if it allows humans to flourish according to their purpose. Although this one may be a little bit hard to explain, I'll try to apply it as I understand it. Through natural law, we can observe morality more objectively on a case-by-case basis, unlike the divine command theory where there's just a general rule that applies to all. With natural law, I would say that someone's purpose is defined individually, so my purpose is different from, let's say, John Doe, for example, and so on and so forth. However, for the person who is voluntarily choosing suicide based on what they base it on, where it's losing control over themselves, lack of family, terminal illness, etc., can we consider something like voluntary euthanasia as this person's purpose in life, especially if this is something that they genuinely want or need, giving them a sense of peace? The last principle that can be applied and will be applied through the thought of legal voluntary euthanasia is the virtue ethics theory. The virtue ethics theory is explained as a sense on focusing on the character and motivations of the person choosing it and the caregiver, emphasizing virtues such as compassion, mercy, courage, and wisdom. In this sense, virtue ethics focuses more on the person who is wanting to end their life instead of the legality behind the action of voluntary euthanasia. Using the virtue ethics theory, we can understand that some things that I have reviewed, such as terminal illness, we could look at as helping the person, having compassion for them as well as mercy by allowing them to end their life instead of making them wait for the inevitable result. When we look at the fact that people suffer from things they never want to deal with in the first place, the view of voluntary euthanasia can become very clear to see and something that we can all understand. The following quote helps us outline the paragraph I just wrote about. Following the recent revival of virtue ethics, a number of ethicists have discussed the moral problems surrounding euthanasia by drawing on concepts such as compassion, benevolence, death with dignity, mercy, and by inquiring whether euthanasia is compatible with human flourishing. And that comes from Euthanasia, the Virtue Ethics, and the Law from 2002. So in conclusion, the voluntary euthanasia is a subject that cannot be easily approached and does not have a simple solution. Through this paper, I've outlined the reasons why it can be legalized to help those who are suffering through horrible pain who do not want to financially burden their family with debt after they pass on, as well as a solution for those who truly do want to die, to do so without the fear of messing something up, leading to an even more painful death that they would get at the end of their lives. With that being said, I also outlined some of the legal reasons and stances on why it's something we still cannot fully support due to the fact that if voluntary euthanasia is legalized, it leads to an even more slippery slope of consequences for society. In general, calling into question the possibility of some people being volunteered for euthanasia that may not even really want it. Eventually, it is something that's a totally real possibility, and that we end up legalizing it, but then we also may not. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you, and hopefully I did well. All right, bye.